Well, hello everybody, and thank you very much for joining us today. We do apologise for the little sort of a technical delay that we had. We had issues getting all the presenters in one room and ready to go. I'm Indiana Joseph Hubbard. I'm the Director of Creation Research UK, and today we're going to have our little live stream Q&A session. We're going to have presentations from each one of our speakers. With us today, we have not only myself, but also our International Director, John Mackay, and our medical biologist, Dr. Diane Eager. And they'll join me in just a moment, but for the time being, let me just run you through the evening and give you a bit of a plan as to what we'll hopefully be able to do. The first thing to say is, if at any point throughout the presentation you have any questions, please do put them in our live chat. It's being monitored and we will be able to get those questions and answer those questions. Thank you to everybody who's already sent questions in as well. That's been very useful to have some questions already here. You can also email us at info@creationresearchuk.com, and then we will be able to get to those questions as well. What we're going to do, you've seen the title of our webinar, One Blood, Many Races. We're dealing with that sort of tricky, icky issue of race. Creation, racism, how it all fits together and what a biblical point of view is. And we're going to look at many different aspects of that, from the sort of biblical side to the historic side to the genetic side. It's really important to kind of get the big picture and understand what the Bible really teaches about race. So what we're going to do, we're going to have three presenters with three presentations. We're going to start off with John Mackay. He's going to deal with sort of the history of race and a biblical point of view when it comes to race. And then we're going to have a little break and we're going to have a Q&A section all about what John Mackay has just said. So if at any point you have any questions, stick them into the live chat, stick them into the comments, and then we will be able to get to them at the end of John Mackay's section. Next, we will have Dr. Diane Eager. She was a medical biologist, a lecturer at Canberra University in Australia, and she will be presenting on the genetic side of race and looking at the biology. And again, if there's any questions, stick them in the live chat, stick them in the comments, and we'll have a little Q&A session at the end of Diane's presentation. Then I'll be presenting, well, I'll be looking at race, but we'll be looking at a practical example of race and also dealing with the issue of Neanderthals and how they fit in the Bible as well. And again, there'll be a little Q&A session at the end of that. So stick your comments into the chat box or the live stream. And then after those presentations and after those Q&A sessions, we will throw it open to everybody. If anybody's got any questions, if anybody's got anything they would like to ask, then yeah, you can ask us questions regarding creation, evolution, the Bible, anything about the subject in general. So I'd like to welcome our other two presenters with us tonight, if they'd like to come on and say hello before we start. There we are. There is John Mackay and there is Dr. Diane Eager. Hello, everybody. It's really good to have you here. And again, as a little sort of a sort of a warning or sort of disclaimer, this is only the second time that we've done this. This is the first time to a UK and a USA audience. So please do bear with us as we're working through the technology. But Lord willing, it'll go lovely and smoothly and it'll be fantastic. All right. Well,
and it's 4 a.m. in Australia as well.
Indeed. John, do you think that it would be able... do you think you'd be able to turn your volume up a little bit on the side of the iPad, if that would be possible?
Okay. Let me try that. I think there's a button around the corner here. Okay, go there. That's nearly at the maximum level. But
that's fine.
Good there. That's good.
Speak nice and loudly, you'll be fine.
Now, there we are. That's me. Down under.
Excellent. Well, in that case, we'll hand it over to John Mackay to start and run through the presentation. So I'll just get the slides up and running. And there we go. All right, then it's goodbye from me and goodbye from Diane as John starts the presentation.
And Joseph, you can put the slides up in the slide operator box so I can press forward or whatever. They're not there at the moment.
You need to go on the right hand side. You need to go down to slides.
There we are. Look at that. Mastering technology at my
Indeed.
dinosaur. So that's great. Well, welcome everybody. And we did a draft version of this yesterday, which is on YouTube. And this is an expanded version because we never do the same thing twice. and actually races are like that as well. Notice our title, One Blood, Many Races. Races is a big issue at the moment. Black Lives Matter, politics everywhere, failed seminars, crash seminars, a big issue amongst Christians and non-Christians alike. Let me just press my next button there. It's so political here. We've had a petition put to our government here that actually involves the sort of work we do. I must admit, I never thought we'd get a petitioner trying to raise signatures to deal with this one sort of lecture. That's one of many we do, but let's have a look at some of the content. It talks about these creationists here in my state, Queensland, believing in a supreme being who created the earth about 6,000 years ago, but this is anti-Aboriginal. It's opposed to Aboriginal culture, which is 60 to 120,000 years old. Now, I don't know if you've worked with Aborigines. I've worked with a lot of them. And the one thing I know that they differ from European culture is that they have now or the dream time. No concept of 10 years ago, 10 minutes from now, or 100,000 years ago. That's definitely not Aboriginal, but pursuing the concept, there are penalties involved in this petition. You see, the author of the petition and his signatories are saying that any creationist, anyone who believes the biblical record of history at face value, is actually a racist person and falls under racist vilification laws. One little IQ question. If you're going to accuse somebody of racism, then I wonder where you got your word from. There's no doubt about it. It comes from the word race. But unless you have a clear concept of what a race is, you can never be racist. I mean, if we all had the same face and you just described someone's face shape, you would be critical of them, but it wouldn't be racist. To have racism, you must have a concept that separate races exist. So
John, I'm just going to butt in 1 second very quickly.
Yeah.
We can only see about a quarter of your face.
Okay,
So you may just want to
back a bit.
Adjust yourself so that you can see you in all your glory.
Our watches
there.
Yeah?
That's much better.
Can you see my whole face now?
That's good.
That's good. Okay. Where do we get this concept of racism from, and what about race? When you have a look at the word race, it actually still is used in scientific papers. I say that because many Christians want to run away from the word race and pretend it's not in science, but it actually is. They want the concept of only one race, the human race. All right, look at our little piece. It's a paper that was written on science of rose studies, but it's studying one particular race of a rose. Now, you might be used to words like that, but they've been in the scientific literature for nearly 500 years. And a race is the smallest distinguishable unit of a species. So you may have one race that's got everything in common, except one hasn't got thorns and one has. They both breed with one another, so a race is the smallest distinguishable group of a species, but the race can interbreed with all other members of that species. Now, when you go on one step further and you say, where do we get these words from? I've got a moral to the story with you before we go any further. Yesterday, as we were thinking it through, we came up with this ditty, this summary, this moral point, this aim. Whatever unites people who have got racial conflict, whatever unites us must be greater than what divides us. In a Black Lives Matter world where it seems anybody who's not in the Black White movement is going to be stomped on somehow, whatever unites us must be greater than what divides us without denying either or both. Can you solve the race problem by denying that races exist? Well, my answer to that is definitely no. But let's continue. Let's give you God's big picture, because we don't just want to criticize here, we want to replace with positives. The biblical picture claims to be the word of God who is there. Black Lives Matter claims to be the opinions of very politically motivated people who are here right now. But back in Genesis, we read that God said, let us make man in our image. But when you go back to that beginning, back to the Adam and Eve, you will find that, well, I would if I could move on to my next. Seem to have a suspended slide here, Joseph. It won't move. When we go back to Adam and Eve, which should be the next slide, and again, there we are. We have one man and we have one woman. Can we use the word race? Well, not really. It's like, what surname did Adam and Eve have? They didn't need a surname. There was only 2 of them. If there was 100 of them, they still mightn't have needed surnames because we can recognize 100 separate people. When you get 1,000, surnames start to become helpful. Adam and Eve is enough of a distinction. So could you have been racist? Nope, there weren't any races. There wasn't even the human race. There was 2 humans. So race involves numbers as well, and numbers of types. But by the time you get nearly 2,000 years down the family tree, from Adam through Noah to the ark, and the 3 families that are going to get off with their daughters, and Noah and his wife, who are never going to have any more children as far as we can find out, can we use the word race? Well, maybe on the edge of it, because Ham is definitely dark. Japheth is definitely fair. But the next event that's going to bring this concept up is the Tower of Babel, where the people are separated. They've rebelled against God, so God has separated them, so they cannot act together to have universal evil. Now, at that point, you'll find that Ham's children, particularly through the Canaanites and that, are showing up variations in skin color. They're showing up variations in culture. They're separating. They're becoming separate subgroups that can still interbreed with one another. You could actually use the word racist after the Tower of Babel by saying, hey, I don't like those white ones. Oh, I wouldn't mind my daughter married to one, but I really don't want to know one personally. That's racism. We usually see it the reverse, don't we? I mean, Charlie Chan's famous line, I can't tell the difference between any of you white people. When you have a look, the difference between the races is what actually makes them races. Can we solve race problems by trying to deny they don't exist? Let's ask where the word race came from. I like tracking down words. It actually helps us, particularly when you remember the Bible says God will judge us by the words out of our own mouth. The English took the word from the French. It's just amongst many things they took from the French, isn't it? But when English take words, have you noticed what they can do with them? They borrow them, they bend them, they can even break them and bounce back the bits. Look at some of the things that happen with the word race. Horse race, human race, mine race, rose race. Now, there's the same word used 4 totally different ways. And all of a sudden, you end up with quite a bit of confusion. What am I talking about here? Well, the French got it from the Italians, and the Italians got it from the Arabic/Hebrew. And if you go to Hebrew, you find the head of a thing is called its rosh. You want a bit of an illustration of that word? You find, first of all, mentioned in the Bible in the first book, the head of the serpent, the one that God promised would be stood on by the Messiah. He has a rosh. It's a literal head. By the time you get to the book of Numbers, the concept, well, he's the head of our house. That's there. Then you get to Judges, and it goes even broader. You have the head of a kingdom. And then the broadest you find it in the whole Bible is God, who is head over all the universe, Rosh. You go one step further, and you have a real race problem. You see, the Bible doesn't paint a picture as the best they could be. It paints them up, warts and all in needing of a saviour, including you and I. Because there's a problem that came in with Adam and Eve called sin that's affecting whatever part of the family tree you're in, whatever skin colour you've got, whoever your immediate rosh or head is. Acts chapter 6. In those days, when the number of disciples was multiplied. Oh yes, you know, when there's only 5 in your group, you're pretty well all agreed. But when there's 500, have you noticed some people don't seem to necessarily think the same way as you did? Either lack of experience or just ignorance or what? But it happens. In those days, when the number of disciples was multiplying, there arose a complaint against the Hebrews by the Hellenists. Hellenists? Today, you would commonly know them as Greeks, or you've got a Hellenic club downtown. The complaint is their widows were neglected when the daily distribution. You can imagine some of this, can't you? I can't take any more mint yogurt on my mashed peas, or they're getting more than we are. We all do the same. I wonder what you do to solve this problem. You see, the Hebrews, to sort this problem out, you first of all have to know which ones you're talking about. So Hebrew people are descended from Judah. Judah was descended from Jacob. Jacob was descended from Abraham. He was a descendant of Eber. Eber is where we get the word Hebrews from. And Eber, he was a descendant of Shem. Shem, do you remember who Shem was? Shem was one of those sons who actually got off the ark along with Noah. Got off the ark because of the big flood that God had sent to destroy all mankind except for Noah and his family and all the world as well. What about the Hellenes? You can go to the Hellenic Peninsula area, where you're going to Greece. They are the descendants of a man called Helen. Helen was one of the three sons of Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha. But who was Deucalion? You know, one of the evidences you're looking for if you want to test the Bible's history of man, that we all came from Adam via Noah down to whatever family group you're in today, is this is the evidence you come across. Deucalion was the Greek name of the man who survived the flood, along with his three sons. Noticing some similarities? If all this is fairy stories randomly over the planet, these details are going to be missing, but they're actually there. There's abundant evidence the racial groups are related via Babel, via Noah, back to Adam. Read that for a while yourselves. Ponder it. Distinguishing Hebrews and Greeks, distinguishing any racial group from any other racial group, starts with identifying their different ancestors. Racial? Did I use a racist word? Listen, identifying the word race is no more racist than identifying the word evil happens to be evil. Actually, what we're identifying here is their different rosh, and that's a word that's come down to us as race. Going one step further, the Greeks and the Hebrews are in separate rosh. But if Adam is everyone's head, then he's our head. All of us come from him, so there's one rosh at that end. But by the time you get to Noah, everybody's in Noah's rosh. There's one rosh there as well. But wait till Babel gets hold of this, because Abraham may be the head or the rosh of two groups, the Arabs and the Jews. But you see, I'm Gaelic. My dad came from Scotland. I belong to a separate rosh totally. I have no ancestry back to Adam through Abraham. I'll go back through Noah. Separate rosh, separate races, separate family groups. Back to our real race problem. You see, the Bible doesn't paint up as people as having all wonderful lives without any faults or defects. No, King David's listed in there. You do learn some of his good points, but he's a murderer and an adulterer, and he too could be forgiven by a holy, righteous God like you and I can. In Acts chapter 6, they found a solution to their problem. In those days, when the number of disciples was multiplying, there arose a complaint against the Hebrews by the Hellenists. Yes, they had similar letters in their alphabet. No, they didn't sound the same when they spoke them. Yes, the Greeks had borrowed the alphabet and made some of the symbols into consonants, which the Hebrews didn't do. But anyway, they were pretty close to colour. Hebrews are a little darker than the Hellenists. Totally different religious groups. There were conflicts. A complaint arose against the Hebrews by the Hellenists. Their widows were being neglected. Look what it did. They chose Stephen. Stephen, a godly young man. Sort this out, Stephen. We're busy out there preaching the gospel. You can be a great benefit here. Sort out this conflict. Now, what do you think Stephen's solution would have been? Because Stephen is also famous for being the first Christian martyr. When we go one step further, I've got no doubt Stephen's solution was that. You people want to fight, you say you become Christians, then your love for Christ must outweigh your hatred of Jewish culture. It must outweigh the things you don't like amongst the Hebrew people. You must love one another as Christ loved you. One in Christ alone. Remember the point we've been making? That if you've got a racial conflict, and they are very real, identifying race, as I said before, is no more racist than identifying evil is evil. But if you want to solve the racial problems, now listen, you can believe there's one race if you like, and it's of no use to you whatsoever in solving racial conflict between black people and white people in your district. Whatever you give them that unites them will have to be greater than what divides them. without denying either or both. You deny the skin color is it's different, you won't get anywhere. You deny there is a real conflict because you say they've got a false belief about race. Sorry, you won't solve any problem at all. Jesus Christ, who created man in his image, and that image was defaced by sin, and that goes right to the flood, and that goes right to Babel, where God gave us different languages, and he alone can unite us through Jesus Christ, who is greater than all. Now, some of you are afraid of using the word race because it's evolutionist. Hogwash. The word came into English 500 years ago. It's still in our biology courses. Remember the science article about race of roses? I grew up with words like that because my dad was a pretty good gardener. And it struck me as, okay, it's a very convenient term. What's it mean? Well, the KFPC bit is not a brand of chicken. That's a summary of the words that we use in classification. The words that the Christian gentlemen, such as Carl von Linné, came up with to describe all of the parts of God's biological creation: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Where did he get words like genus from? Straight out of the Bible. No, not the English one. He got it straight out of the Greek and the Latin Bible, because those are the languages you used at university in those days. Genus, where would it come from? Genesis chapter 1 and verse 11. And God created things, each according to their own kind. No, that's not the Greek version. That's the English version. But that word kind in Hebrew, it's min. And it means a separate, discrete kind in which the creatures in it are all related to each other, but not related to any other group. Okay, if you read your Greek Septuagint Bible from the 3rd century BC, compiled by Jewish scholars in the Greek language, because Alexander the Great and the others had made Greek the universal philosophy and language was widely read. The word for kind, the word for the Hebrew min, happens to be genus. And Carl von Linné borrowed it for science. Please don't think concepts like genus are evolutionists. They are straight out of your Bible in Latin or in Greek. And then you get species. Species is a creationist word. Things are specially created. Genus, that's a group of related things. Species is a smaller group within it. But then they discovered some roses that are red have thorns, and some roses that are red don't have thorns. They needed a smaller subdivision. These little racial units continue on. They're noticeable. You can write about them. Genus, species, race. One last time, then make sure you note that the smallest distinguishable unit of a species can interbreed with all other members of that species. Really important you keep that in your mind. Oh, no, we won't go as far down as strains and things like that. There's other sort of nifty little things you can use for bacteria and whatever, but this is where we're going to, because I'm going to run a test to finish this section. Yes, we took all these pictures of separate racial groups around the planet. Can you spot any real and long observed, stable and actual differences in all these people groups? Of course you can. That's why the police put up a report in our newspaper this week. A young boy had left home. They don't know whether he's kidnapped or not, but the police reports gave his name, gave his description as Caucasian. Why? Because you understand it, I understand it. It meant he wasn't black, he wasn't Asian, he was some sort of white offshoot of Norwegian come Anglo-Saxon. These differences are very real and they're stable and they actually exist. Don't be afraid of using the word race because it's evolutionist. It's not. It's abjectly creationist, a product of the Tower of Babel. Races are real. And if you want to solve a problem with them, bless the heart of all the well-intentioned Black Lives Movement, if there are any out there, but their solution is political and it won't work. It's really a power-based one, and they want to take over the world if you want me to expose their hearts. You want to solve the problem? Be like a Stephen. Make sure that whatever unites people must be greater than what divides them, without denying either or both. Identifying race is no more racist than identifying evil happens to be evil. You see, the race problems are only solvable if you have one person, and that one person who unites us is Jesus Christ. Well, I'm done. I'm going to hand back to our chairman now at the moment and follow up more on what we do on creationresearch.net. So thanks, Joseph. Come on and share the next little bit.
Thank you very much, John. That was fantastic. We now have a little opportunity to ask John any questions, if anybody has any questions. We're just checking the live chat box to see if there are any questions. Several comments and people liking it, but at the moment we haven't got any questions come through about John's stuff. Just remember, if at any point during the presentation you have any questions, do just stick them straight into the live chat. We will pick it up and be able to answer them. Just remember that there is actually around a minute's delay between us physically speaking and you physically hearing us. So because of that delay, we're sort of talking while most people haven't actually heard, oh, now it's time for questions. So if you do think of any questions, please don't hesitate to stick them in the chat box. We will come to them at each individual question and answer session. And if we don't get to them at each individual question and answer session, we will address them at the end in our sort of open floor, throw it open to everybody Q&A session that we will have. Still nothing come through at the moment, so if anybody does have any questions for John as we move forward, please do ask them and we will come back to them towards the end. But what I'm now going to do is I'm now going to ask us to be joined by Dr. Diane Eager, who was a medical biologist, a lecturer for Canberra University, and she's going to deal with the more biological, the more sort of genetic side of races. So if both myself and John disappear now, Diane, are you all good and ready to go with the slides?
Yes.
Fantastic. In that case, we'll
yes,
throw it over to Dr. Diane Eager for the next presentation.
Thank you, Joseph. Just see if we can start my slides. No, we've still got the last of John's slides up here.
You should be able to just go to the next. So if you go down to slides, on the right-hand side.
Yes,
yep.
All right.
And you should just be able to click on next, and that should go to your slides.
Now I've got
next one.
Next one.
There we go.
All right. Yes, I'm going to talk about skin color, because one of the regular questions we get at Creation Research is that if God created only two people, Adam and Eve, how do we get all of the variations in skin color? You saw some of John's photos there. You've got huge variation between people who are black, people who are white, and people who are various shades of brown, all in between. How do we get all of those variations? Well, there has been one suggestion that it's just a mix of genes that God somehow built into the system. And you may have even seen an illustration like this. Now, what this idea is that if there are two genes for skin color and you have variations within those genes, so the genes can come in a light variant or a dark variant, with each generation, the mother and the father will give one of the variants of their pair of genes. So we've represented that as the dark coloured genes are the capital letters and the light coloured variations are the small letters. So you can get in one generation, by mixing and matching, all of these variations. So that's a nice idea, but I don't think it will work. And in fact, it doesn't really fit the biblical picture of where skin colour came from. And the reason for that is, well, for a start, the genetics has moved on from there, and we know that there are lots more genes involved, because skin colour is not just decoration. It does have a function. You may know about this. The main colour in skin is a pigment called melanin, which filters out ultraviolet light. That's radiation from sunlight that can damage our skin, but we do need a bit of it because it does help the skin to make vitamin D, which is a really important hormone in our body for particularly for absorbing calcium. So you need a sort of balance between filtering out the damage of ultraviolet light and letting some in. And so there's lots of subtle controls where our skin color should be able to respond to different changes in the light environment. So the genetics has moved on from this, but also we need to look at the biblical picture and remember what God said about everything that he had made when it was finished. He said everything was very good. So did God build in this variation in the original creation? Well, if all of those combinations were very good, we could say that. That's a possibility. But we do know now that some of them aren't. Even before we got into the nitty-gritty of genetics, those of us with an Anglo-Celtic background like myself, who moved to Australia where there's a lot of sunlight, we have a problem. We have too much sunlight for our skin, or rather, our skin is not suited to the sunlight environment. So there's a booming industry in Australia in sun cream and umbrellas and sun hats, and every summer there's a publicity campaign to make sure that you protect your skin. So we know that light skin is not really the best sort of skin to have, and there are some genetic studies that are drilling down to see what's happening here. A recent one was done in Spain, actually, where some scientists found a gene that does code for light skin, and they decided that they were coming from an evolutionary mindset, and they decided, well, this is just an adaptation to the fact that in Europe you have these long dark winters where people don't get enough sunlight, so having lighter skin is a good thing. And they made this comment at the end of their study. We thus provide evidence for an adaptive value of human skin depigmentation, in other words, lighter skin in Europe, and illustrate how an adaptive process, now notice the evolutionary mindset there, that somehow it is our skin changing in order to cope with a change in the environment. So let's go back to and illustrate how an adaptive process can simultaneously help maintain a disease risk allele. Now, what do they mean by that? Well, allele just means gene variant. So they mean the light color variant carries a disease risk in it. Now, that should immediately produce alarm bells. God would not create something with a disease risk built into it. And in fact, they then go on to talk about a disease called melanoma, because this gene variant does mean that people who have it are more prone to a disease called melanoma, which is a form of skin cancer, a very nasty form of skin cancer. I know several people who have had it, including one who died in his mid-40s. And one of the researchers made this comment: melanoma has been an invisible illness to natural selection. Well, I would dispute that, but that's another issue. But notice what he said: it is the price that has to be paid for the improved survival of the species in areas of the world with low solar radiation. Now, God would not build in a disease-forming gene or a gene that just makes you a little bit more susceptible to disease. So what is the real answer? Well, let's just stop for a moment here and remember the little family tree that John put up, starting with Adam and Eve. What would their skin colour have been? Well, it would have been very good. So they would have had enough melanin to filter out any ultraviolet light that came in. Ultraviolet light does actually have a function, so there was some in the beginning, but there would be not too much to prevent Adam and Eve from making vitamin D, and they would have been able to respond to any changes in the light environment. All of those subtle controls would have been there working perfectly. So they were probably a mid-brown sort of colour. We are sometimes asked, well, what colour were Adam and Eve? were they black or white or somewhere in between? Well, they're probably a mid-brown colour. And if you think about it, the whole world's population, most people are a mid-brown colour. The two extremes are the minorities. The really black people and the really white people are actually the minority. But that's not it's not just statistics that why we believe that they were a mid-brown colour. That just seems to be the right sort of combination of allowing enough ultraviolet light in to make your vitamin D, but filtering it out to keep your skin cells from being damaged. However, the world did not stay very good, rather sadly. We know that, and by the time of Noah, the world was corrupt, and we see as John mentioned, some of the changes reflected in the names we have of Noah's three sons. Ham has the sense of being darker, Japheth the sense of being lighter. So some of these subtle controls were starting to break down. Now, Noah's three sons then lived through the flood, and they became the ancestors of all of the people who live on earth now. But before that happened, there was a very big event, which John also mentioned, the Tower of Babel. Remember, after the flood, God told people, spread out, fill the earth, but they didn't want to do that. They were taken up with making a name for themselves, so they all gathered together with this big building project, and they were going to make a name for themselves and defy God. But they were all together. So even though there would have been variation in skin colour, because we know that it is inherited, so Ham's descendants, Japheth's descendants, and Shem's descendants would be there all mixed together, but there would have been variation in skin colour already existing. But then what happened? Well, let's have a look. If we can just start the slideshow again. Let me see. Is it starting again? No, right. Okay, let's go on. So at the Tower of Babel, you have some variation, but mixing is still possible because people are all together. But at the Tower of Babel, God split up the people into a whole lot of different groups. Now, he wouldn't have split up individual nuclear families. He probably divided them up into clan groups. And if you read the Table of Nations in Genesis, it does actually give the lines of descent of the various descendants of Noah's three sons. So all of these groups would have been split up, and for a number of generations, they would not have bred with one another. They started to disperse all over the world. So whatever characteristics that these groups had already there in their genes would have been reinforced because you would have had inbreeding in small populations. So whatever characteristics they had, including skin colour, would have become the norm for that population. And there were quite a number of generations would have passed before people started mixing and matching once more. Now, we live in a world where people do mix and match because we have a lot of people moving all over the world. That's happened for the last few hundred years, but there would have been quite a number of generations where all of these groups were separate, and whatever distinctive characteristics they had just became reinforced and became the norm for that population, and that would have included skin colour. So can we explain not only the fact that we have different skin colours, but also the distribution? Because the people who did that study in Spain, and the general evolutionary mindset is that the reason there are black people in Africa is because, well, it's hot in Africa and there's lots of sunlight, so people need to be black. So they went black. The reason there are light people living up in Northern Europe is because there's not much sunlight there, so they had to go white. Well, that actually sort of works for Africa and Europe. It doesn't work for the rest of the world. It doesn't work for the Americas, where if you look at the so-called native populations, they migrated there just like anybody else migrated there, even though that they're called natives. They didn't evolve there. but they are all brown. If you start right up the top, even what the groups we used to call the Eskimos, they're now called Inuits, they're brown. Native Americans are brown, down into South America, even all the way down to Tierra del Fuego, where it's very cold and very dark in the winter. They're brown as well. But the really interesting example is actually Australia. If you look at the Australian Aborigines, they're all dark, whether you live at the top of Australia or the bottom. And if we just go to a map of Australia and going from the Middle East, right? Think of the people from the Tower of Babel migrating out, taking their piece of the gene pool. And it is interesting, we can trace some of the genetic roots of the Aborigines, and there's a connection with India. We've written that up in our newsletter, the same as we've written up that study that was done in Spain. If you're interested in finding out more of the details of these, I'll put up the place where you can find those after this. But the Aborigines are all dark, whether they live at the very top of Australia or whether they live down the bottom. Now, Australia is actually the right way up as far as weather goes, right? Hot air rises, so the top part is the hot part. But Australia is not all sunshine and tropical weather. There are cold areas of Australia. I happen to live in one, which is right down in the bottom corner there. Now you can see I've marked where the 40-degree south line is. That's 40 degrees latitude. That is as far away from the equator as Spain, where they did that study in the light-coloured genes. And below that is the island of Tasmania. Now the Tasmanian Aborigines were just as dark as the ones who live up in the top end. So to explain the colour of the Australian Aborigines, it's nothing to do with evolution. It is to do with which bucket of genes they took from the gene pool, just as much it is from the Europeans who went in the other direction from the Tower of Babel. Which bucket of genes did they take from the gene pool? And then where did they go? So if we go back to the Bible, we can understand an awful lot of what we see in the world today. After all, the Bible will stand up to any honest scrutiny, and I'd like to encourage students that we don't have all the answers, but God's word does stand truthful forever. So stand your ground on God's word. The science will eventually catch up, just like it has with explaining why you have a very large country with huge variations in its climate zones, but yet all of the people who came here first were all black, whether they lived up in Cape York, up in the top end where it is tropical, or whether they lived down in cold Tasmania, which does have long, dark, cold winters. Now, if you would like to see some of the details of some of these studies, they are written up in our fact file, which is an archive of our newsletter that we send out regularly, where we just trawl the normal scientific news, see what people have found in the world, and help people to look at it from a biblical point of view. We also have questions sent in to our other site, our question and answer site, Ask John Mackay, and we do have several questions on skin colour, on human history, on human races there. You'll find some more details there. So I'll hand back to Joseph now, and do we have any questions, comments from the other two speakers?
Yes,
or
we
from
do.
any of the people who are...
We do have a few comments. I don't know if John wants to join us as well.
All right,
I've got a few.
Stop the slides now.
There we go. Lovely job. Right. Well, I'll read out some of the questions. We have had a few questions come through regarding what Diane has just been saying. We'll read the first one, which has been in our live chat here. It says, so gene mixing is responsible for the very good middle brown, and degenerative mutations is responsible for the extreme skin colors. Is that right? Gene mixing is responsible for the very good middle brown, and degenerative mutations are responsible for the extreme skin colours. Is that right?
Well, not quite. The extreme colours, the very dark and the very light, are the result of degeneration. In terms of the the very light people, what happens is that we cannot ramp up the production of melanin when we need to in response to increased sunlight. For people with very dark skin, their melanin cells are just in full production all the time, and they don't turn off when they shouldn't. So if, say, very dark people from Africa move to a place like Canada, which has a very long cold winter and people have to live indoors, of course, because it's dangerous to go outside, they do become depleted in vitamin D unless they add it in their diet. And in some places, they actually put vitamin D in the milk, or people take vitamin D tablets. If you live up beyond the Arctic Circle, the people who live there have a diet that is rich in vitamin D, so they get away with it. So those two things certainly are degeneration. The middle colours we have now are probably a mix of what was there originally plus degeneration. So
okay.
It's a good example of how the world started out very good, and it has been corrupted around the edges because of human sin and degeneration of the environment.
I'll throw in something there, Joseph, because coming from a Celtic background, Gaelic, depending on whatever word you want to use, father comes to Australia, discovers he's got freckles in Australia because it was too cold to show him up in northern Scotland, right? But if you look at my skin, I spent a fair bit of time looking at my skin because I wanted to be free to work with many coloured different groups. And you will actually find on my skin, I have every colour of every race. I just have to carefully look at any place. So on the bottom of my feet, which are pretty thick skin, I have an orangey pigment. On the arms of my skin, I have everywhere from black spots, brown spots, tan spots, and white spots. Right, so I'm the United Nations on one arm, and every example there of the wrong skin color is due to loss of controls. Now that's probably the thing Diane's emphasizing most, and it's key. I can get all these colors with simply breaking up the control mechanism as opposed just to the color mechanism. In fact, Diane, you might want to comment that these are multiple function things, not just switch on, switch off, one thing at a time, because that's where most people go wrong. Do you want to throw in any more on that?
Oh, yes. The more we look into it, the more subtle controls we find. So that's why it takes far more than 2 genes to explain all of the variation.
Uh-huh. Very good. Another question that we've had here, this was actually sent in to us earlier, which I will just read out. I'm going to get one of the pronunciations wrong, but we were just talking about it before, Diane. It's talking about this chap called Thor, who his theories of migration from Africa to South America, or to South America to the Polynesian Islands, have they ever been authenticated by DNA or any other evidence?
All right, yes, Thor Heyerdahl. Yes.
Heyerdahl, that's right,
yeah. That's right, yes. If any of you remember the book, The Kon-Tiki Expedition, where Thor Heyerdahl had this theory that the Polynesians originally came from South America because there are some similarities in their culture, and he was opposed by the people of his time. This is back in the 1940s. So he just challenged them and said, all right, well, I'll prove that it could be done. And so he and 5 friends built this traditional raft and sailed across the Pacific, and they did actually do it. They came out of it alive. It's an epic, it's a good read. I recommend it. But anyway, getting back to to his theory. I think there is a grain of truth in that. There was a recent study only just published a couple of months ago, actually, which looked at the genetics of Polynesians and of the Native Americans who lived on the Pacific side of South America, and they did find some genes in common. So it is possible that those people did meet and mix and match. His other theory was that people sailed across the Atlantic from Africa. One of his bases for this was that there's buildings like we have the pyramids in Egypt. There are also pyramids in South America. In some of the ancient civilizations. Now, I think there's also a grain of truth in people sailing across the Atlantic Ocean as well. Certainly in North America, some of the North American, Native American tribes, they will say our ancestors came from the place of the sunrise, so, meaning from the east. So they did come across the Atlantic. So there were probably two lots of migration into the Americas. One came across the Bering Strait and down from the west, and others from across the Atlantic. We know that the Pacific Islanders are the most brilliant navigators on the planet today, that they are just amazing, that they can sail around a vast ocean like the Pacific and find the different islands because they have studied the ocean currents, they study the birds, the clouds, as well as the stars. Now, we have to go back to the Tower of Babel rather than to evolution to think of what is the real history of the human race. The Thor Heyerdahl, of course, was a normal sort of secular evolutionist, so he had the idea that you've got primitive people who were advancing upwards, whereas we know the real history of humanity is that people started out very clever, very intelligent. Think of the people at the Tower of Babel. They had the technology to build huge buildings, so we shouldn't be surprised that we find the remnants of huge buildings all over the world, not just in Egypt and not just in South America. And also, they are the recent descendants of a family that built an enormous seagoing vessel. So they had technology, they had intelligence, they could study the environment around them. So I have no problem with ancient people sailing around the world and having the technology to build pyramids and other enormous buildings in different places all over the world. And we know from archaeological studies, ancient people were not stupid. They were technologically brilliant and could probably build things that we can't build now. There's one lovely study on our fact file, actually, which is a quote from Stephen Hawking, that human beings are getting dumber because the evidence from ancient civilizations is that people were brilliant. Now, that's not a problem if you look at the biblical history of the world and think of people going from Noah to the Tower of Babel in smaller time frames, in smaller numbers of generations. We're not talking about thousands of generations. We're talking about sort of dozens of generations. So that knowledge could have been maintained.
That's good.
I'll just throw in something there about migration, because what you'll find is if you go to Iceland, we do have a time even in the 1400s where it's a matter of record that there was no clear water in any direction around Iceland. Usefulness, that's when the wolves were migrating basically from Europe across to Canada and vice versa. And likewise throw in some people who could make it all the way across to the North Americas by walking across the solid water, right? Not quite doing what Jesus could do, but they could walk across it when it was frozen. Likewise, I've taken opportunity, having gotten to know many of the Maori people, the South Sea Islanders, having gotten to know many of the Aboriginals, and having checked their seagoing skills, it is very evident when you even get in a light plane and you fly out the middle of the ocean, you can actually learn to point to where an unseen island is if you actually look at the waves, because the waves will come, and if there's an island in front, some waves will bounce back, and you will set up a wave pattern which is like a big neon light, island ahead, and you just turn your boat and follow the apex of that arrow. So they actually did manage to migrate all through the Pacific with just very simple but common sense skills that most of us think don't exist. Thor Heyerdahl, his raft, or what was left of it, landed just up the coast from where I live. So I've always been fascinated by the fact, nobody liked his theory, but he actually made it work, right? And that's the bottom line. If he could do it, others could do it. And migration around the planet from a society that had already built ocean liners, well, come on, everything after that is really just simple.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you very much, both of you. There are more questions, but I think we should move on to the next presentation, and we'll come back to some of those questions and address them in the final Q&A session at the end of the evening. So the final little segment is actually myself presenting. So let's get our slides up. There we go. Thank you very much to John and Diane. They will join us in a minute, a little bit later, as we do the final Q&A session. A reminder again about the creation fact file and about askjohnmackay.com. It's our Q&A site, which has got articles from all over the planet, from wonderful experts who have come in and answered the questions that have been sent in to us. So you'll find a wonderful host of Q&A stuff there as well. And especially for the UK, we have our a brand new website up and running, creationresearchstore.com, where you can buy things like this: Your Questions About Creation Answered. It's a wonderful book, a very useful book. It's got a similar kind of concept to the Ask John Mackay site, but it's got these questions which, hey, some of you may have not even thought about these as questions, but you will certainly come across many of them as you're doing your everyday evangelism, and they're very important questions. And they get right to the point with the answers, no wishy-washy. They're just direct, straight to the point, give you the evidence, and give you an answer from a biblical perspective. Your Questions About Creation Answered, a wonderful resource now available in the UK. Okay, our topic today, we've put there, what is a race? But specifically, we've kind of already dealt with that concept, what a race is, but we've dealt with it sort of with a few different examples and a biblical history, but we're going to look at a physical example, a practical example, and we're going to try and kill two birds with one stone, because we're going to explore Neanderthals. Neanderthals, the origin of races, the Bible, what is a race? Can we get a proper definition? And we're going to deal with that rather interesting point of view from Neanderthals as well. Now, many of you have heard about Neanderthals. They were discovered way back in the mid-1800s, and they've become really very popular and sort of impregnated into our brains as the old sort of idea of the dumb brute with the big bat who'd go around bashing other cavemen on the head. They've sort of developed, the ideas regarding and surrounding Neanderthals have developed somewhat since then, but you can see just from here, this was published this month, July 2020, in the New York Times, as well as several other newspapers and media outlets around the world. This little report here: DNA inherited from Neanderthals may increase risk of COVID-19. Those pesky Neanderthals, but it's interesting, DNA inherited. They used to think Neanderthals as these dumb brutes who were some point in, humans' timeline and ancestry, but didn't really have any effect on us today. It is interesting how the science has moved forward, and all of a sudden people are worried that Neanderthals could be to blame as to why we're so susceptible to COVID-19. Interesting. Here's a hymn. Let's get down to the basics. What has a hymn got to do with Neanderthals? Well, quite a lot, actually. Praise to the Lord, the Almighty King of creation. O my soul, praise him, for he is thy health and salvation. All ye who hear, now to his temple draw near, praise him in glad adoration. Question: who wrote this? The answer: a chap called Neander. He wrote it in 1680. He was a German Reformed pastor, he was a theologian, he was a very famous hymn writer, and he became so renowned in the German area around him that he actually had a valley named after him, the Neander Valley. Neander Valley? Neanderthal? Yes, the Neander Valley was named after the German hymn writer, and Neanderthals were named after the Neander Valley where they were first found. There it is. First discovery of the first Neanderthal skeleton way back in the 1850s. Now, ever since they were first discovered, different ideas surrounding the Neanderthals have sort of been built on as more evidence is discovered. So in order to give us a foundation, we're going to have a very brief look at the evolutionary perspective on Neanderthals over the years, as well as the creationist effect on the perspective on Neanderthals, and how they've been viewed by the different camps. And then we're going to sort of pull it all together and say, well, what do we actually know about Neanderthals? And we're going to have a look at some very, very up-to-date and very modern discoveries to actually try and answer that question: what is a race, and how do Neanderthals fit into that concept of race, and how do they fit into the Bible? Interesting. You see, the first idea, Thomas Huxley, he was well known as Darwin's bulldog. He really pushed Darwin's idea of evolution and ape men. And when he first discovered, or first went over to study, the Neanderthal skeletons that were discovered in the Neander Valley in Germany, he said, hey, these fit somewhere in our ancestry. They fit somewhere between apes and human beings. These are the ape men, the dumb brutes that lived in the valley, that lived in the caves, and they are our ancestors. So you went from ape men to somewhere in humans' ancestry to Neanderthals, rather than being directly in our timeline, so apes, Neanderthals, humans, they started to place the Neanderthals sort of as a bit of a sideline. So at some point in Earth's history, there was a common ancestor which diverged into modern-day humans and Neanderthals. Then they argued that Neanderthals were our distant cousins. We had some kind of a common ancestor. They're sort of making Neanderthals more and more human as we go. And then indeed, not too long back, they realized that actually going on, well, not only the fossil evidence, not only the artifact evidence, you know, the tools and the paintings and so on and so forth, but when they actually started to do DNA analysis on Neanderthals, they came to the conclusion that Neanderthals were very closely related to humans, if not humans, so they decided to reclassify them as Homo sapien variation Neanderthalis. Ah, you notice that variation there? You see, the concept of race is all around us in the scientific literature, and I was reading a fascinating medical report on the usage of race in medical and in, the defining species. You know what John said earlier? Homo? Homo is a genus. Genus is in your Bible. It's translated into kind in our English language. Go back to the Latin language, which was translated from the Greek into the Latin. Homo is there. Oh, no, sorry. Genus is there. It means kind. And homo is kind. So homo is kind. We are the created kind. We are the created humans. Species from special. We are specially created. But variation, yeah, you've got race now. Variation Neanderthalis. Still human beings, but a special variation of human beings, a race of human beings known as the Neanderthals. Okay, let's have a quick look at creationist ideas over time. We've had a look at the sort of the evolutionary history, and it's interesting to see how the evolutionists have gone from basically Neanderthals being practically apes, or certainly half ape, half human in our sort of ancestry somewhere, to essentially reclassifying Neanderthals as just a variation within humankind, within human species, within the kind. The kind, of course, being reflected to a biblical point. We were created in the image of God. We were created as a kind. We were also created to reproduce after our own kind. Interesting. Now, you see, creationists have actually been ahead of evolutionists regarding Neanderthals for a very long time. You see, when creationists first assessed Neanderthals, they said, hey, Neanderthals are human beings. Fantastic. Unfortunately, creationists have sort of started to lag behind a little bit in recent years, particularly in light of the new evidence that we can see. So let's have a look. Creationists start to evaluate Neanderthals and say, yeah, Neanderthals are human beings. And then they began to say that Neanderthals are part of this one race concept. The one race concept that creation research likes to warn people about, because you have to understand, as we've dealt with earlier, God did not create in races, God created in kinds. Yeah, he didn't create one race. Adam and Eve, we dealt with that earlier in John's little segment. God created in kinds, and the Bible explains how we get the many races that we do today. It's the Tower of Babel. Interesting. There was a time when they were assessing Neanderthals and there was only sort of 1 or 2 skeletons really known. And so creationists assessed them and said, well, perhaps Neanderthals were just a bit arthritic with bone diseases due to lack of vitamin C, and they had rickets. Then they said that Neanderthals could just be very, very old. There was a very popular book that went around that claimed that as human beings age and get older, their face and bone structure and density changes, and perhaps Neanderthals were just really, really old people. I mean, if you read in your Bible, people were living a lot longer closer to creation. Adam lived to 630 years, Methuselah lived to 930 years. Methuselah lived to 969 years. These people were living to nearly 1,000. It's an enormous length of time. And perhaps Neanderthals were just really old people, remnants of that time close to creation, when as they got older, their bone structure changed. It was even argued that Noah could have been a Neanderthal. Well, this has sort of been disproven not only by genetics, but also by the fact that we've now found Neanderthal baby skeletons with exactly the same distinguishing features, and we'll look at some of those distinguishing features as we go along, as the adults. They say that Adam was a Neanderthal or Noah was a Neanderthal just because of the bone shape and the idea of as you get very old. Then there was the argument, particularly popular after the DNA experiments were done, that we're all Neanderthals and there was no very real difference between us and Neanderthals today. People from European descent are just Neanderthals, or the onbreeding from that. And that sort of works, but it also sort of doesn't, and we'll discuss why as we go on. But we just want to quell a few of these I've called them their wacky creationist ideas, because yes, there are some very wacky evolutionary ideas, but unfortunately the creationists have come across with some very strange ideas as well, and very wrong ideas over the years regarding Neanderthals. The first one is that Neanderthals didn't exist. Now, this idea came in 2 different forms. It was sort of that they were just humans. There was absolutely no difference between Neanderthals and humans, or that Neanderthals were just hoaxes. Yes, there are hoaxes in human evolutionary past, particularly the way we think about it. You have heard of Piltdown Man. Piltdown Man was a straight-up hoax. You've heard of Nebraska Man. He wasn't quite so much as a hoax as just a very bad science and very bad study methods, in terms of it was the fact it was a pig's tooth that had been interpreted to be a human being. But yes, there have been some problems. However, the sheer evidence for Neanderthals, both from their skeletons, their art, their culture, and their artifacts, they are definitely not hoaxes, and they definitely did exist. Then you get to some really strange ideas, like Neanderthals were not actually humans at all, but they were genetic mutants created from demons and humans. You read about an interesting little segment in Genesis chapter 6 where it talks about the sons of God. It talks about the Nephilim. It talks about, hey, some translations say giants. And the idea was that Neanderthals were this sort of half human, half demon sort of offspring that you end up with, and weren't actually human beings at all. Now, it's an interesting little segment in scripture, and we're not going to deal with that right now, but there's a fascinating biblical study there, and if you want to come back to us with that on the question time, you're more than welcome to. But the reality is, it's complete nonsense when you start assigning Neanderthals to that segment of scripture. Moving on from that idea, you had the idea that Neanderthals were giants. Neanderthals were the cause of Noah's flood because they were this abomination, half spirit, half human, sort of weird combination. But the reality is, none of these actually hold up to any form of evidence, whether biblical or scientific. So what do we actually know about Neanderthals? And let's try actually putting it into perspective, particularly regarding this idea of race. Well, we actually know quite a lot about Neanderthals. We know them from their tools. We know them from their paintings. We know about them from their skeletons, and we now even have their DNA fully sequenced. It's remarkable what you can find when you go out there. So let's go through these one by one and work out what we can actually learn from Neanderthals, particularly classifying them as a race and sort of seeing how they fit into that biblical picture, as well as being humankind. Neanderthal tools. This is a wonderful flint scraper. It's a sort of a jasper sort of flint silica scraper. Wonderful, beautiful colors in it. This is one that we have in our collection in the Genesis Museum of Creation Research here in the UK. Yes, we're working on our museums project. You can find out more about that if you go to creationresearchuk.com and learn about some of the incredible fossils and artifacts that we have in our exhibit. I've even got a few little examples of these tools here. If I just... There we go. You can get a nice little bigger. Here's a few little examples of these tools. You can see all the little scraping edges that they would have used. And, you know, really these tools are quite amazingly sophisticated. I've actually got a little quote here. Notice this came out just this year from the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences. It says Neanderthals were not the dumb brutes once thought, but showed an incredible level of sophistication through their tool making and craftsmanship. You see, when you actually look at a tool, you understand that it has been designed. You see, stones by themselves do not make tools under natural conditions. Oh, they may make a sharp edge. They may make an edge which could be used for cutting, but even so, you still need to use intelligence to actually apply that sharp edge to a piece of meat. But the reality is, when you get to wonderfully technical tools like this and stone axes, and hey, there was even a study into some Neanderthal artifacts that were found where they actually would go through and select the right kind of bone in order to carve it into needles to make clothing. Hey, this is some sophisticated stuff. This is some cultured stuff. Yes, the reality is when you learn about Neanderthal tools, and yes, Neanderthal tools are distinct. You can tell they're Neanderthal tools because they're a different style to all other tools. Stone tools, that is. Hey, we are talking about a specific culture, but the fact that you have intelligently designed tools, and notice that quite a wonderful level of sophistication, Neanderthals were definitely human, the original created kind. Neanderthal paintings. Yes, it's taken a while, but there has been many different Neanderthal paintings now discovered. This was a report in National Geographic, and look what they said here. The findings suggest that Neanderthals and modern humans had the same cognitive abilities. In other words, in order to draft this wonderful, beautiful, and craft this amazing and intricate painting that you see on the cave walls, paintings which include things like animals and ladders and all sorts of wonderful stuff, yeah, intelligently designed paintings equal humans. In fact, just going on their paintings, you saw that quote from National Geographic, there's no difference between Neanderthals and humans in terms of brain computing power. All of a sudden, we're moving away from this idea of Neanderthals as a dumb brute. Just from the evidence, we can see that they not only had a great level of sophistication and culture, they also had cognitive ability, intelligence, that was certainly on match with what was considered modern human beings. Okay, skeletons. Here we have a Neanderthal skeleton. It's a wonderful example, but if you actually have a look at the skeleton, compare the two. We have a Neanderthal skeleton and we have a human skeleton. Human skeleton is on the right, Neanderthal skeleton is on the left. Hey, definitely human. There's no doubt about it. They are almost identical in all the important areas, the bone shape, the skull shape, the hip shape, hey, these are human beings. But are they exactly the same? Well, no, not quite. Here's a great example. Here is a human skull, a modern human skull, and here's a Neanderthal skull. Can you tell the difference? Oh, there's definitely a difference between the two of them, but which one's the Neanderthal? The Neanderthal is the one on the right, the larger one with the bigger brain space. Yes, Neanderthals had up to 600 cubic centimeters more brain space than modern humans. We were talking about this earlier though, weren't we? In Diane's segment, in the Q&A segment, where we were talking about human beings. You know, human evolution says that we started down there and we built up and up and up. All by ourselves, we evolved into the highest form which we're at today. The Bible says, no, that's not the case at all. We started up here as perfect human beings. We started up here created in the perfect image of God. And since the fall of mankind, we've been going downhill ever since. We've been getting worse and worse. Our diseases are getting worse. Our intelligence is getting worse. Our ability to live longer is getting worse. Hey, Neanderthals had bigger brain spaces than we did. Neanderthals had bigger brains. That goes against the evolution theory right there. But you just notice not just the brain size, there's other differences. You can see the brow sticks out a lot further. They've got sort of these jutting chins, the nose, there's this big bun on the back. In fact, there are a large amount of physical differences between Neanderthal skeletons and human skeletons. Just have a look at some of the list here. It's not just brain capacity, it's bone density as well. Their bones were a lot denser. Their muscle strength. Yes, you can actually work out where muscles would have gone on a skeleton because you can work out where the ligaments attached, and we can actually work out the Neanderthals were a lot stronger than us. They had a hand grip which was several times stronger than our modern humans. Wow. Size was different. We've mentioned the brow on the skull, the bun on the back, which was to give extra brain space. Yeah, there were quite a few physical differences between Neanderthals. Oh, they were definitely human beings, no question about it, but there are physical differences. And then we get into DNA. Because not only has DNA shown that Neanderthals are in fact human beings, because guess what? They have human DNA. But you know, there are differences in the DNA, subtle differences. But then don't be surprised, we've already dealt a bit with genes earlier in Diane's segment. I have different type of DNA to that which a very dark person has. There's a specific gene which codes for the fact that I have a mutation, so I can't actually hold much melanin anymore, which means on a bright sunny day, I burn really easily. And you know what? A very dark person has exactly the opposite gene. A gene which means he can hold great amount of melanin, which means he doesn't burn on a very sunny day that easily, but it does mean he can struggle living in a much colder environment. Of course, in today's world, we have central heating and all the rest, so it's absolutely fine, but it does make an important point. You see, you can actually distinguish and isolate certain genes in your DNA which make you distinctly you, and make you distinctly belong to a certain people group, or race, or Roche, as John was saying earlier. And that's important, because you notice the BNC2 skin colour that I've put here, that's still present in me today. I'm a Northern European, and it's inherited from Neanderthals. That's that little point that article was making, that newspaper article was making earlier about susceptibility to COVID-19. But you can also see another list of numbers and letters on our little slideshow here. These are all specific genes which are variations on the modern human DNA, and they are distinctly Neanderthal. In fact, if you come from Northern Europe, or you have heritage of Northern Europe, then you are likely to have up to 2% of these Neanderthal genes in your DNA. And that's important, because you're not completely Neanderthal, because you haven't got all of these. You're not distinctly part of that group, although you can find a few people who've got some of the physical differences which represent what Neanderthals had. But the reality is it goes evidence for not only Neanderthals being a specific race, but it also shows that this race was actually part of humankind. It was part of human beings. They did belong to the same kind as us, and they were originally created in the image of God. They belong to the same kind. Fascinating stuff. You see, this remnant DNA is found in modern humans in northern parts of descent. It is part of human DNA, but there are distinctly different variations and different genes than other different races of human being that we can compare them to today. So the Neanderthal race, yes, it was part of humankind. Yes, they were originally created in the perfect image of God, but they had been marred and corrupted by sin, just like you and just like me. Because it's very popular to say, hey, everybody's made in the image of God, you're made in the image of God, I'm made in the image of God. And there is truth to that. We were originally made in the perfect image of God. Adam was. But carefully read chapter 5 and you realize that when Adam and Eve had Seth was not made in the image of God. He was made in the image of Adam. In the likeness of Adam, he was made. Adam at this point was no longer a perfect human being. He had fallen to sin. He was marred and corrupted by sin, and that's a legacy that all of us have to this very day. Yes, we were originally created in the image of God. We have that heritage. We have that privilege, if you like, but we're marred and corrupted by sin. That's why we end up with diseases, nasty stuff. But hey, so did the Neanderthals. They were originally created in the image of God. They do belong to the same kind that God originally created, but they were closer to the original creation, so they were bigger, they were stronger, and they were more intelligent. as well as having distinct variations, both physically and in their DNA, that sets them aside from just saying, hey, they were part of the one race. No, they were a distinct race, but then I'm a distinct race, John's a distinct race, and there are distinct races still here in the earth today. But all part of the one kind that God created, all part of God's family, and all created originally in the image of God. Okay, well, we'll throw it open to questions now. About the little segment which I've just done. We're just going to check and see if anybody else has asked anything. Not at the moment, no new questions. So what we'll do then, in fact, if you do have any questions about what I've just been asking, please do write them in, get them into the chat box. But what we'll do now is I'm going to ask both John and Diane to come back. There's John Mackay. And there's Dr. Diane. So what I'll do, I've got a few questions here. We've still had some more questions which were asked in earlier. So we'll go to that first, and we'll deal with them as we go along. Here's our first question. This is a question which is directed to both John and myself. This was asked a little bit earlier. It says, a question that's on my mind is regarding the geological layers that compose the most fossils. Is it that, or / are those layers consistent globally? If not, how do naturalists explain the widespread deposits if they attribute millions of years between them? And if they believe millions of years exist between the layers, how do they explain the sharp contrasts in places like the Grand Canyon or in mountain ranges? John, do you want to start that, and I'll add any comments onto the end of that? We can't actually hear you, John. You may be muted.
Is that better? Am I on now?
That is better. We can hear you now. Go for it.
Most of those sort of questions come from diagrams in textbooks that are usually put together by teachers, educators, etc., who haven't done much traveling at all. If you want a secular person who's done an awful lot of travel, he's retired and passed on now, but you'll find the professor of geology at Swansea University wrote a book called The New Catastrophism, Professor Derek Edger, who did one thing most geologists do, and I'm grateful to say I've done it as well: get out of the classroom, get out of the ivory tower, travel all over the planet and discover one thing. Most of the fossil layers are absolutely stuffed full. But the thing that's most interesting is they don't go in order of simple to complex. You will find a layer of shells by gazillions, the Jurassic layers that we work in at our Jurassic Ark. And hint, hint, our Jurassic Ark is open now post-COVID, right? You can bring small groups to it, but it's called Jurassic because even though it's in Australia, it's got the same fossils as the Jurassic layer in Germany, the same Aussie trees. You Germans have got our Aussie trees. They grow in Australia today, but they're fossilised in the area of the rocks around near the Solnhofen area in the middle of Germany. So the fossil layers are massive. And the point that troubled Derek Edger as an evolutionist is the immense size of these things. They cover 2/3 of the planet. He had no real explanation. Go back to your biblical basis, and Noah's flood is a good starting point. Go to the bottom of the so-called geological column, and the rocks are all messed up, metamorphosed, cooked, almost no semblance of fossils in them. And then suddenly there's an erosion line. And from then on, you know, the thing they call the Cambrian explosion, no big bang there, but heaps and heaps and heaps of fossils, and they're mostly marine. But Joseph, you and I and Diane have noticed that they're also mixed. You have shallow water shells mixed with deep sea shells. You have land plants, right? All the way. The mixture is what gives it away that this is a flood dump. So there's the characteristics of the real fossil record. Easy to prove. Go out fossil collecting, bang on a rock, collect the rock solid evidence, and you'll find, particularly if you read Professor Derek Edger, he's the one who said, now, chaps, I know we believe in evolution, but the older geologists who are all creationists actually describe the rocks a whole lot better.
Yeah. To add on another sort of dimension to that, I'm going to take the sort of challenge the idea of layers and where that idea came from, because creation research has been doing some fantastic and really revealing new research. Very brief history lesson, 1600s, Nicholas Dino. Nicholas Dino was ended up being a monk, and he became a monk because, you see, the idea at the time was that Satan had tricked us by hiding fossils in the rocks because, of course, shark teeth, they're found in the rocks, but sharks don't live in the rocks, they live in the water. Therefore, Satan must have put them in there to disguise and to trick us. That's an old Greek idea, only they attributed it to the Greek gods playing tricks on them. Nicholas Dino said, no, God wouldn't lie to us like that. If we see something in the rock that looks like a shark tooth, it probably is a shark tooth. Therefore, we can actually ask the legitimate question, how did the shark tooth get in the rocks? And he had an idea of layers, that the bottom layers got there first, the top layers got there last. He said that as he attributed it to Noah's flood, he believed the Bible was true from the beginning, but he said during Noah's flood, the sediment which was in the water settled, then the next layer settled, then the next layer settled, and the next layer settled, and so the bottom layer settled first, the top layer settled last. And there you have the basis for the geological column that John was mentioning about earlier. Everything from the pre-Cambrian through Cambrian all the way up to the Pleistocene deposits at the top, with the Jurassic and the Cretaceous and the Permian and the Carboniferous and everything else in between. It sounds wonderfully simple, it sounds wonderfully logical, but the reality is you have to follow the little line across, because Nicholas Dino attributed it to Noah's flood. But then come along James Hutton and Charles Lyell in the 17 and 1800s, and they said, well, if the bottom layer got there first and the top layer got there last, then the bottom layer is the oldest, the top layer got there the last, so the top layer is the youngest. All of a sudden you have a new perspective on the rocks. You have them being classified by age. And then all you have to do is do what Hutton and Lyell did, which was say, well, if the bottom rocks are the oldest and the top rocks are the youngest, how long does it take to lay rock layers down? And take their principle, the principle of uniformitarianism. Everything we observe in the rock layers has to be explained by processes that we observe today. So if you see a canyon being very slowly eroded by a stream in the bottom, then it must have taken millions and millions of years to erode that canyon out. And it must have taken even more millions of years to lay those rock layers down in the first place for there to be rock layers to erode a canyon out of. All of a sudden you have a new perspective on history. You have one dominated by millions of years. And of course, actually go out and dig around in the real world, actually go and see what's out there, and you realize that rock layers do not form like that at all. They form sideways. Think about rivers. Think about tides. I mean, if you've ever been out to the beach and you've stood on the sand and the waves come in and they wash over your feet, and then the waves begin to go back out, and on the back of your heels you feel the big of all the little grains of sand hitting your heels. Those sand grains are not traveling downwards, they're traveling sideways, and they're hitting onto your heels and they're laying down in layers on the back of your heels. Okay, that's a teeny tiny example, but scale that up to a size of a small stream and you've got much bigger layers. Scale it up to the size of a river, you've got even bigger layers. Scale it up to the size of a delta. In fact, it was a delta that first gave a Frenchman the inspiration to actually do some experiments on how rock layers form. And guess what he discovered? They form sideways, horizontally. Okay, bring it forward to creation research, 2017 or 2018. 2017, I think our first experiment started. And we've actually began doing experiments with flume tanks, where we've pumped, using special pumps, a great big slurry of mixture of grain, different grain sizes, mineral sands, quartz sands, into a flume, with that water moving sideways, full of a slurry of wonderful sand grains. And you can see the layers forming, not top to bottom, or bottom to top rather, but from left to right. Really important to get your head around this, because not only does it destroy the concept of a geological column, it also destroys the concept of millions of years of deposition. It really is amazing stuff, and I'd encourage you to go to creationresearch.net, and you can see, I think it's a 8 or 9 part report now on how our experiments have sort of progressed, and you can see some wonderful examples of how this actually happened. And also for the UK especially, I've got 2 little booklets here. The Rocks Cry Out. We've got one on the Valley of Lyme in Derbyshire, and we've got one on Aberystwyth Bay in South Wales. And these are really important projects because They are actually field guides, so they've got maps and explanations of how to get to find places and some wonderful details of what you need to bring if you want to go and visit these places. But they're not just great as a field guide, they also take you through the site step by step, telling you the fossils and the geology of it. There's an online video which is free to go with it, so you don't even have to visit the places. It sort of works on their own. But in the back of the Valley of Lyme, we deal with this concept of sideways deposition and give a nice little simple explanation of it. And in Aberystwyth Bay, in the in-depth section, we deal with the geologic column. Where did the idea come from, and does it really hold up to what we actually see in the real world? So a good way of actually answering that question is to actually say, well, you need to have a complete revamp of how you think about layers in the first place. Because the reality is, in everything that we observe in the real world, in all of the experiments that we can run, layers do not layer bottom to top, they layer from left to right. And all of a sudden, you've completely got a new perspective on how layers form. And Noah's Flood gives you a very, very good explanation of it in the real world.
Joseph, I'll just throw one more thing there. For our new upgraded website, phone friendly, etc., the icon they're looking for is latest experiments.
Yeah.
Right, and they can click on that and they get all sorts of results on growing fossils, on growing stalactites, on making layers, and again, enjoy the books that Joseph's done for England, enjoy the research we're doing at Jurassic Ark. Come and visit both now, because we're able to actually run small visits at Jurassic Ark in Australia. That's our outdoor Aussie museum. 10 hectares, it's easy to be COVID spaced on 10 hectares, 22 acres of land. So look forward to seeing it.
Excellent. Well, I reckon we've got enough time for a couple of more quick questions, and then we'll have to call it a night. But do remember the Ask John Mackay site. There are plenty more questions on there. Do remember the Q&A book, which we showed earlier. If you go to creationresearch.net, then you will find links to our UK shop, our brand new UK shop. You'll find links to our USA shop, our Australian shop, and you'll be able to purchase these books and these resources for yourself. Let's ask this question. This is a new person who's just asked a question on our live feed. This is probably one for you, Diane, and John, perhaps. How do changes on viruses/bacteria fit into this? Is it like a genus that has variations?
Well, there certainly are variations within viruses and within bacteria. So they are classified using the same classification system that you have for all living things. They have a genus name and a species name, and then they have variations. So that's the virus that's annoying the world at the moment, COVID-19. It is a variation of a coronavirus. There are lots of coronaviruses, but it is a specific variation of a coronavirus. But it has elements in common with other coronaviruses. There are lots of them. They don't all make people sick. Some of them exist in animals. They don't make them sick either. Common cold, or some common colds, are actually caused by other varieties of coronaviruses. So we have come across them before. The same with bacteria. They are classified same way with the normal classification system. And because they have a very small genome, we can actually analyze their entire genome, the whole sequence, and you can see variations within the different genes within them. That's how. So we can now classify them by specific genes. And we know that the different strains that we had identified in the past, simply because of their particular characteristics, we can now identify them by specific gene changes or gene variants.
I'd just throw one thing in there. Everything Diane said absolutely applies. From a geology point of view, if you look at the whole concept of evolution, simple to complex, the virus and the bacteria shoot it in the foot, because viruses are dependent critters. The virus cannot exist unless there's already a very sophisticated cell in which it can enter and borrow the reproductive apparatus, whether it's a plant or whether it's an animal, and take advantage of lended intelligence, if you like. They don't possess their own mega reproductive capacity. So you cannot have viruses unless you have sophisticated creatures already. So there's no simple to complex possibility of the evolution of viruses at all. And this is true even for many bacteria. Hence, one of the best concepts you'll get is you can't have everything until you've got anything, and you can't have anything until you've got everything. You can't take vast amounts of time to make a creation with or without viruses. They are all so interdependent. So forget Charles Darwin's nonsense and have a look at like some of the MP4s we've just put up that you can download on how to recognize a creation. We touch on that in one point. It's a course that Diane and I devised over many years. You'll find it very helpful in homeschooling. So just go to creationresearch.net, click on the shop, download the MP4s called Recognizing a Creation, and the viruses even Raider mentioned it.
Excellent. Thank you very much, both of you. I think we've got time for one more question. We wanted to try and wrap it up after around an hour and a half. I think we've been streaming for just a little bit longer than that. So let's make this our last question. I know there are a few questions on there that are unanswered, but thank you very much for asking them. Again, if you go to creationresearch.net, click on the Q&A button, you may find some of your questions answered there. If your question isn't answered there,
you can't send them in.
Yeah, exactly. Please do send them in, because we've got a team of people around the world who we can actually get to answer them, and we would greatly appreciate any of your questions. This last question, I think this is quite an important question actually, to be addressed. He says, I have heard that there is more diversity in DNA within a single race than across races, which could imply the racial boundaries are not genetically accurate. Is this true? I've heard that there is more diversity in DNA within a single race than across races, which could imply the racial boundaries are not genetically accurate. Is this true?
Okay, just a couple of comments from me, then for Diane. Remember, a race by scientific definition, smallest distinguishable, identifiable, stable group within a species. Now, it's certainly true that if you take the rose with thorns and the rose without thorns, you may be staggered to find that the one without thorns has simply got a marker to stop the thorns actually developing, right? The information for that is still there. So when you're talking about the genetic diversity within a race is greater than across the races, you are playing with words in one simple direction. Anyone can pick someone who is Asiatic from someone who is Caucasian, no matter how much mathematics you use to justify that statement. That's one reason why we did these DVDs, and why I finish off with my section, How Real Are Races? Can you spot the visible, observable, stable, long-term stable differences? That's one. Origin races, that's one. Real roots, whether you're Jewish or Arabic, whether you are black African or white European, those differences are real, no matter how the geneticist likes to add up the so-called sum DNA. So Diane, do you want to add any comment on that?
Yeah, yes, I agree. It's just a matter of what do you mean by diversity? Are you talking about individual genes? Yes, there are quite a number of gene variants, and some of them are only found in particular people groups. But if you're looking at the entire human genome, yes, we're all extremely similar, because we all belong to one kind that's all the goes back to Adam and Eve through Noah and through his three sons. So it depends on whether you're looking at one particular gene or even a few genes that might be related together, or whether you're looking at the whole human genome. So that's not a very helpful statement in terms of defining different races. It's used for political reasons. There is tremendous diversity within human beings. That's partly built in, partly the result of degeneration, but it doesn't stop us from all being of one human species made in the image of God, with variation. That some of it was built in, some of it's because of degeneration. But we haven't split up into different species.
I think the claim of this, closer or more diversity within races than across races is a similar kind of argument to the whole being 99% genetically similar to an ape. If you want, in many ways, yes, we are. Because if you look at the structure or the way that things are put together, then yes, we are quite closely similar in DNA to an ape. Of course, the flip reverse to that is, well, look at how many differences there are between us and apes. Yeah. That's an incredible genius who's actually managed to fit that amount of difference in 1% of DNA, right? But the reality is, the percentage of difference between DNA of one animal and another animal, or even one race and another race, entirely depends on the kind of information that you select to actually compare. Because there's no way that you're actually going to get the entirety of the information and compare the two of them together. It's practically impossible to do that. What you have to do is select specific genes and select specific sections and actually compare the two of them. And just like any biased scientist, you can actually select portions that are going to be quite similar. That's how you end up with a 98 or 99% similarity between apes and humans, or certainly the claim that it is. There's multiple other problems with that claim regarding apes and humans, but the biggest one is it really depends on what information you're selecting to actually compare. You could use the example of like a book, right? If you select a portion of a book that is exactly the same, but the rest of this book is different, you're going to end up with a very different book. It all depends on the information which you select to compare. It's the same kind of principle when you're applying at differences between races and across races, because you can almost guarantee you're not looking at the same piece of information when you're comparing those two different things together. Anyway, that just about brings us to the end. There's been no other questions, although come through in the last few minutes, but thank you to those who have asked questions that we didn't get around to. Please do check out the Ask John Mackay site. Please do check out creationresearch.net, and you'll find links to our UK, to our Australian sites, to our research, the latest collections, and as well as some of the work that we're doing around the globe with our museums project, with our research and experiments. There's some really important and amazing stuff going on. I'll mention one last little resource, which is a fairly new resource, came out last year, Tights, Mites and Fossil Fights. This really is a research book from a lot of stuff that we've been doing, from our fossil collections to some of the research in stalactites and stalagmites, one of the biggest arguments against a young Earth. And hey, it's a young world after all. We take you through some of our collections, our fossils, our experiments around the globe, really fascinating stuff, and all real experiments and real evidence. They're real pictures. They're not sort of diagrams and ideas and hypotheses. No, they're real pictures. They're real fossils. They're real evidence presented to you in a very, very readable and accessible format. So again, go to creationresearch.net. You can find our shops for our resources. You can find our research and experiments and some really wonderful and amazing stuff that's been going on. But thank you very, very much for all joining us today. We've hoped you enjoyed it. We would like to make this a more regular thing, the sort of the idea of tackling a different topic in each webinar, in each live Q&A session. So today we've dealt with races. I don't know, next one may be fossils. We have no idea, but we'll be tackling a different topic and the all-important Q&A section. So please do tell your friends, like the channel, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you get notifications as to when we're doing new events and new videos that go up, and do get behind us and support us in the work that we're doing. But thank you very much. It's been great. Thank you very much to our two panelists today as well, Dr. Diane and John McCain. And yeah, I think we're ready to finish. So thank you very much. If we switch our microphones and videos off, that should all end.